get to these kitchen cabinets then, Ollie, what are you even talking about when you say a kitchen cabinet? Let's define the term so we actually know what we're discussing here. What is a kitchen cabinet?
Yeah, and as I start to set out some thoughts, just to say, we will have questions, but I don't consider myself to be in any sense the font of knowledge on this. What I'm doing is sharing techniques, tips, stories that have worked for me and that I like sharing with others. So you don't have to share a question. It could be your perspective, your insight, what works for you. I think for me, a kitchen cabinet, and of course that comes from the phrase, the cabinet that surrounds the Prime Minister, but it is a selection of trusted allies who you know you can turn to as the years and months go by for advice, for a sounding board, for a bit of support. And the crucial thing is, in my view and my experience, that these are people who are personal to you. They might cross everything you're doing in your life. So many people on this call and increasingly around the world wear more than one hat. And your kitchen cabinet get that, they understand that, and they support that. Most of all, they aren't some distant advisor giving you some pearls of wisdom. They've got your back. They are in your fan club, if you like, in your group of supporters. But that doesn't mean they're not afraid to give you some harsh and brutal feedback on regular occasions. So that's what we're talking about, cultivating that personal board of advisors. Some of you may have it, some of you may be thinking about growing it, but I think it's a really powerful thought to revisit on occasion.
I want to come back to the topic of who should be in this cabinet, or how do you pick those people, those members of the cabinet, in a little bit. But just while you've mentioned getting honest feedback and advice, can you sort of speak a little bit to how you look to elicit advice from people when you're really looking for, thoughts, advice, suggestions on something that matters to you?
I think the first lesson I've learned is that you have to ask for advice. It could be about the current state of play for a situation you find yourself at. Maybe you're at a crossroads in your life. It could be on a specific piece of work or an aspect of your work. And there might be many ways to ask for that advice: one-to-one, a public call, or to a small number of people. That could be over the phone, it could be over email, and so on. I think the number one thing I've learned about asking for advice is, firstly, it pays to use that word advice. And Robert Cialdini is very good on this. He prefers that word to feedback. If you ask for advice, you get the listener to lean in a bit more. Feedback tends to make them lean back and ponder a bit more. Advice gives them that permission that they can lean in. One of the founders of Pixar is very good on this, inviting us to use the word candid feedback. And candid, they presume, is a better word than honest, because honest is like, now for once, Drew, I'd like you to be honest. Well, Drew is always honest. Let's use the word candid. But the other thought I've got, Nassos, that I thought I'd share with the group today is, in my experience, you have to ask for advice 3 times. And the reason I say that is, and I'll give you an example if that's useful for the group. The first time you ask for advice about something, and perhaps you can relate to this listening today, you say, well, how did you think that is? I'd love to know what you think of this. The answer you tend to get first is, it's fabulous, darling, or the equivalent. Yeah, it's wonderful, it's brilliant, I love what you're doing. Yeah. So we ask a second time and we say, no, really, what do you really think? I'd like your advice. And then I tend to get that second feedback. No, seriously, it's great. It's really good. I mean, I can see what you're trying to do and you're clearly making some progress. And for me, it's that third time of going back. And by the way, this can happen in very quick succession, perhaps in less than 30 seconds. And it's that third time of saying, okay, let me tell you what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to go from getting it from good to world class, or the best ever, or amazing. And to do that, I need you to be brutal. I need you to pull no punches. I promise I won't be offended. We've known each other long enough. Whatever set of phrases works for you, but I need you to be 100% candid, and I'm listening. So don't spare me anything. And it's only on that third piece of feedback that I've seen the floodgates open.
Yeah, it's a great tip. I'm actually just thinking about this myself at the moment, because I'm looking to get more advice from good interviewers on my podcast. I've done quite a few episodes at this point, but I do really want to take what I think is, a good podcast to a great podcast. So yeah, that 3-step rule is definitely going to be top of
Well,
mind.
we should tune in, and you should tune in to Meta Learn, everybody. It's a brilliant podcast. And if you want to ask the question 3 times, we can talk about that. I mean, to illustrate this point very briefly, Nassos, I spoke to one of my lifelong, but certainly last 20 years, dear friends last week about something very dear to my heart. And I got the serious answer from them. And she's a formidable woman. She said, I think it's fantastic what you're doing. It's really exciting and so on. And I said, no, seriously, but I'd like a bit of and she hinted that there might be things. And I said, now then, we've known each other for long enough. You can give me it with both barrels. She said, honestly, I'll give it a 2 out of 10. We then had one of the most useful half hours I've had all year where she didn't spare anything. Yeah. So if I hadn't pushed on that, likewise, on the dishing out end of the spectrum, I came off a call on Clubhouse last week with somebody who asked for a bit of feedback on their moderation, which I thought had been very good, by the way. And it was only when she asked again, and by this time we knew the dance because we talked about it overtly in the Clubhouse call, but it was only when she gave me permission to give more granular feedback that I was able to help. And a very personal subject, Nassos, but I would not have presumed to have given anything like that download had she not really asked for it in that sense. So hopefully useful.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. You know, someone might be a bit surprised if you give them the most raw, honest form of the truth the first time they ask for feedback. But if they persist, then, you know, that's obviously what they're looking for. Talk to me, Ollie, about the Sevens group. So I know you've had a number of kitchen cabinets for different projects, but you also have one relatively consistent one, this Sevens group. Give people a little bit of context for what that is and the value of it for you over the course of your career.
Yeah, so this is known as a concept. It sounds quite sort of rarefied if I call it a mastermind group, but some of you might be familiar with that. And this is a regular group that meets on a regular basis over some time with a consistent membership, if you like. So others will have their own definitions of a mastermind group, but it's about peer support. It's about that mutual sense of support going both ways and all around the group. That idea was seeded in my mind by EO, the Entrepreneurs Organization, global chapter-based network. And what EO said about their forums was, here's our suggestion. For forums, in EO this is now, Entrepreneurs Organization, keep it for the 1% stuff. The 1% best and the 1% worst stuff in your life. Everything else talk about in the pub. Okay? And by that, they meant on best, you would have a situation where somebody, get your violins ready, would say, what am I going to do about this £2 million tax bill? Yep. Now, the heart bleeds and all that. But actually, seriously, you'd have extraordinary situations where someone hadn't told their own brother, their own mother, their best mates about something exciting but challenging that they were going through. And of course, at the other end, there was so much stuff. So the 1% idea was in my mind. A very dear friend now, Dan Bowyer, invited me to join a group that is now known as the Sevens. And it has been life-changingly supportive for me. And if you haven't got a group like this in your life, I'd just seed the idea of growing it, developing it, thinking about it. It's 7 of us, pretty equal, four guys, 3 women in the group, a range of backgrounds. We don't all live in the same country now. And this is a group that has met on a regular basis to discuss everything: health, relationships, finance, business, hopes, dreams. We've got to know each other unbelievably well. And we're not afraid to share things about the future, major concerns in our life. And I think that having that group over time has been massively powerful. So I'm just seeding that idea of a group like that in your life. And some of you will have that already. And just to give you a tiny glimpse now, so I know we've got a lot to get through. In the heyday of Sevens, that was actually very structured, in person, now occasionally much more virtually, obviously, with feedback from every individual. So Kim would have, if Kim was in Sevens, 5 minutes for updates as we'd go around, a strict 5 minutes, believe it or not, on the clock for quick questions and answers, clarifying questions about the feedback that Kim had given. And then in any one meeting, we would table 1, 2, maybe 3 topics for wider conversation, something that was on the group's minds, a crossroads they were facing, a real challenge. And then we would pick that apart. So hopefully you get a sense of the power, because when then Jane brings something to the group, we all understand the context. Whereas if we were just mishearing it for the first time, we wouldn't understand why it was so important.
Really interesting to hear that. And just for people on this call, some people might be thinking, well, you know, isn't this what friends are for? Like shouldn't I be talking about my hopes and dreams and challenges and difficulties with my friends? You mentioned the structure, but I'm just curious, how do you differentiate between this personal board of advisors, this kitchen cabinet, and what other people would class a friendship, and what purposes does it serve, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think in my case, the joke within my friendship group would be no one has a clue what I do anyway. So I think the simple fact is we should feel comfortable talking about whatever we want with whoever we want. However, the truth is we have certain topics which we just, for whatever reasons, don't discuss with everyone. So here I'm talking about that group around us, and it could be around a particular project, and we'll come to that, but around us as individuals, particularly in a business context as well. Whereas so many business conversations are just about the business aspects. And if I start sounding off to my high-level contact at some global energy company about my back, or about my family situation with homeschool, actually that would seem much more natural, thank goodness, in the last year, and I welcome that. However, too often those conversations have been siloed and have barriers around them. So I'm talking about throwing off those limits, really.
Yeah, it's a very good point as well, because I think, we mentioned this, I think, briefly in a conversation last week. It's that, those things that you might find difficult to share in certain contexts, perhaps within your life, but also it's not the kind of thing you want to be posting on Twitter, is it? I've had this problem with my back, or I've got a £2 million tax bill or whatever. There's a certain context in which there are certain things that are difficult to share, but can be incredibly valuable to share in that environment, right?
Well, I also think it's cultivating a group of people who it doesn't seem strange to continually go back to for a hand on the tiller. Sounds saucy, doesn't it? For a little bit of a steer from time to time. And that's what I'm talking about, is that consistency over time, that ability to go back to them. And also, as you say, I've spoken to probably 3 or 4 people in the last couple of weeks who want to sell their businesses. Well, it wouldn't be necessarily appropriate for them to put that out on LinkedIn, on Twitter, or wherever else. So it's having that trusted circle that we can go back to. And I think that's really important over time, that we can continually check in with. So I think thinking about who's in that group, and we can talk about that.
Yeah, and we've spoken about this sort of long-term set of relationships that you build over time with a sort of a general cabinet where you discuss everything. Let's come back to the who, but I'm just very curious as well. I know you started a number of special cabinets for different projects, not least Tenor, which started off from a cabinet that you formed. So can you just speak to that, like bringing together people, mini cabinets for specific projects?
Yeah, so I think, and the truth is, TOTS, yesterday, the Today programme, World Service, ITV News, Channel 4 News, throughout the last 3 years of TOTS Beneath the Surface, I have deliberately cast, and we call it internally, Friends of TOTS. They don't have any power within the organisation, obviously soft power, they influence us. But we have told them in those terms, we would like you to become a friend of TOTS. And in my mind, that's a kitchen cabinet for the Turn on the Subtitles campaign. He wouldn't mind me saying Paul Lindley is a friend of TOTS, founder of Ella's Kitchen, chair of the Mayor of London's Obesity Task Force, and he sits on the board of Sesame Workshop, which owns Sesame Street. So he's there to give a hand, to give some advice privately, but also to shout about us from the rooftops when appropriate. I've got a couple of other examples in my mind where our friends of TOTS are hidden within very powerful large corporations, and I shouldn't mention them here, but behind the scenes, they've been able to say, look, this is stalling, or this needs a bit of extra momentum, and they're equally valuable. So I think thinking about that, TOTS as an example. Going back over 10 or 12, probably almost 15 years now, I had this mad idea that some of you will know about, which was what would happen if we gave 10,000 kids £10 and a month to see what they could turn it into. Well, punchline is that had turned into the country's biggest schools enterprise competition. It's still going. It's called Tenor. But the only reason it started, really the only reason it started, was I read a newspaper article about a vicar, but then specifically called 9 or 10 friends and colleagues to a one-off breakfast at Villandry in, I think, Great Villiers Street, a bit of a cheapskate, so I bought them breakfast instead of lunch or dinner. And I gave them full permission to tell me what they thought and to support in any way they felt they could. So the great thing about those one-off cabinet meetings, if you like, is you're saying, look, I trust you. You're saying, I'd like you to connect with each other, because we had, funny enough, an old colleague of Gideon's, probably Victor, who was at the Treasury. We had somebody who was within the National Enterprise Campaign, Enterprise Insight, who became our partner. Crucially, we had Shah Wasmond, who ended up connecting us to Andrew Reynolds, who funded the whole scheme off the back of that breakfast. So that, if you like, is a pop-up cabinet, without going too far down the metaphor route, which changed everything. And genuinely, without that one cabinet meeting, Tenor would not exist today, no doubt in my mind.
Yeah, I remember hearing that story for the first time when we were doing the initial brainstorm for the course materials. And yeah, it just stuck out to me as, you know, getting people together in a room and bam, out of nowhere, this huge project just comes out of it. I know you've also sat on a number of advisory boards, Ollie, as well. So could you just speak to that again in terms of, I think we're differentiating, we've spoken about friends, we've spoken about specific cabinets, we've spoken about general cabinets. Where does this sort of advisor role sit, and what can we draw from that to learn more about the role of the kitchen cabinet in our careers?
Yeah, and it's worth saying that on those pop-up cabinet ideas, if you like, there is a certain energy that comes with the connectivity around that cabinet table. I just want to sort of go back to that just momentarily. Now, so funny enough, I'm doing one tomorrow for the founder of the UK's largest primary schools chess challenge. I know at least one person on the call is coming to that. I'm very grateful to them for that. But actually there, I know that the 10 of us on the call will enjoy each other's company, but we're there in service of Sarah, the founder of the chess challenge. We've all been sent a brief of 2 pages beforehand. We're not there to confuse her, but we're there to be helpful, right? And to me, that's a really powerful intervention, which costs for the participants, apart from me and Sarah, 1 hour. So I think these things can happen. On advisory boards, I've tended to put them around most of the things I've been involved in. I'm not talking about formalities of non-execs and chairs, separate structures. Advisory board, much less formal. I set up the first one for my own organization, the Rainmakers, because we were in our early 20s. We thought we might get ripped off or taken advantage of. So we asked at the time the senior partner of a leading tech and IP law firm. We asked the launch marketing director of Orange, Chris Moss, known to Drew, and we asked the global marketing director of Saatchi & Saatchi if they would join our advisory board. Did that mean something to them? I hope so, but it gave us a really powerful sounding board and sent out a certain signal. Really quick observations now, so I was conscious that we want to get lots more in. I'm proud to sit on the advisory board of the Tech London Advocates, and Global Tech Advocates, a global group now, over 10,000 members, of Zinc, which I'm a fellow of, which is an amazing social impact accelerator and business builder, of 1 Million Mentors, which is brilliant, founded by Rashanara Ali, and also of Founders for Schools, which has several advisory boards for different specialisms, founded by the unstoppable Sherry Kutu. What I think the best boards do, and I know we're going away a bit from personal cabinets, kitchen cabinets, to more project-based. 2 things very briefly. The advisory board, they're not afraid to ask it for advice. And that sounds terribly obvious, but I think outside the whole snowstorm of updates, to crystallize what it is specifically that you're putting up for discussion or conversation and that you want advice on, number 1. The second thing the best organizations do with their advisory boards is they don't just catch up during catch-ups. Okay, I think that's very limiting to time bound it to a board meeting. So the best ones will give you a heads up and say, Francis, I'm off to see Centrica. Is there anything I should bear in mind? And what they mean is anyone I should bear in mind. So that ability over time to just check in. And I think what we're doing when we grow our kitchen cabinets is we're basically asking for permission to be in touch more regularly on a range of topics and on a personal basis. Would it be all right if I check in from time to time, just as a sounding board? Feel free to do the same for me.
Such a nice way to frame it. You're not formally asking someone, you know, will you be on my kitchen cabinet, in the same way you don't want to ask someone, will you be my mentor? But you're seeding it there, and you're creating an opportunity for that dialogue to happen. Just as we move towards the end of this section, Ollie, and get to the Q&A, one of the challenges in the course for this lesson actually is to get people to kind of dream about who would be in their ideal kitchen cabinet. Yeah. Can you just speak to, you know, what's the purpose of that? Why did you want people to do that in the course? And maybe offer a few suggestions for, or a few thoughts about who might be in your dream cabinet.
Well, firstly, I think the first question, I'd love your suggestions, by the way, on the call today. Firstly, I find it a playful exercise, but it does things to your mind. So I would for sure be putting Will Smith in my kitchen cabinet alongside Oprah Winfrey. I'd probably want Mark Carney in there. He seems pretty cool to me around climate. But I've got a few sort of fancy members of my kitchen cabinet. On a serious note, though, I would think if everyone took now, I'm not saying on the call, but after today, like a blank sheet of paper and said, well, look, I'm not going to go around calling them my kitchen cabinet, but A, have I ever thought of bringing together some of my nearest and dearest advisors? But B, who is in that group? If it was 10 or 12, who would I say is in it? And what I would encourage everyone to think, and someone listening to this will almost certainly be on this wavelength already, is how diverse are they in terms of backgrounds? Yes, but also industries. Because I love this thought that outsiders reinvent industries. So if you find yourself in the charitable sector, what are those connections from the private sector or government sector? Are there enough of them? And how diverse is it? Forgive me for sounding a bit pious. How diverse is it age-wise? Okay, incredibly important to me that in my kitchen cabinet are people in their 20s, are people in their 70s. Unbelievably important to get their different perspectives. Enough said about that. In terms of the exercise, though, I just think it's really important because the best kitchen cabinet experiences might be about peers and not prospects, obviously, but a peer-to-peer exchange. However, what I think we can do increasingly, Nassos, is build it out a little bit to say, look, somebody for me I put on a pedestal, Sir Tim Smith, Dame Julia Cleverden, absolutely, titans in terms of their sectors, but with the right arrangement, if you like, I can count them in to my virtual cabinet, my kitchen cabinet, to go to from time to time. And I think that's a really important dimension, not to see them as distant and on a pedestal, knowing that they will give you a word of advice, especially when you give them that real permission to give you both barrels.
Yeah, those people might not be as inaccessible as they first seem in the context of the cabinet, right, when warmed up over time. Right, let's move to the Q&A. I can see some people have already popped some questions in the chat, so get yours in there as well if you haven't put it there yet. First one is from Lorraine. So she asked, I wonder how long it took to build that level of total trust within the sevens. Could you speak to that, Ollie? And just generally, I think the concept of trust here as well feels very important in the context of the kitchen cabinet. So yeah, how long did that take with the sevens group?
I was very struck by one of the golden rules back in the EO forum, which was of hyper confidentiality, not their phrase. And specifically, for example, no pillow talk. So what goes on tour stays on tour, and it doesn't even go to your other half. And I think that's a really powerful thought there, particularly when you consider the sort of roller coasters that you might then go on with every aspect of your life. For me, I found two things. I found the concept of immersion incredibly important, and that could be an experience. So for sevens, doing a retreat to one of our members' homes or home cities, which was out in Copenhagen. Certainly for missions, having been lucky enough to bike over the Golden Gate Bridge, possibly with Claire over the years. But that retreat thought, I'm not saying we have to go to a spa, but that idea of getting away with a small group and just allowing yourselves to enjoy each other's company and bond, unbelievably important. The other one is a bit cheesier, which is I've used certain exercises with groups which have really bonded the group. I'll give you a tiny example. If you haven't done a lifeline exercise before, it's incredibly powerful. Just imagine along a blank sheet of paper, along the x-axis, here we are, homeschool, that would be time from birth to today. And at the y-axis, it would be good and bad. So depending on your temperament, you might put your birth at good or bad, but you would go from there. Just imagine doing that exercise with a very small group. So I very nearly died when I was 2 in hospital. I won't bore you with the details, but my parents nearly lost me. So that was a pretty bad day, probably, for me and them. And mapping that. Then again, out of the blue, I got a scholarship when I was 13. That had to be an uptick. And to cut a very long story short, Nassos, plotting out my lifeline, as that exercise is known, and daring to share it with the small group. I've learned more about people in an hour doing that exercise than I have in 10 years of friendship. So I'd say from time to time, don't be afraid to hack into getting to know each other, but maybe leave the beanbags at home.
Yeah, it reminds me of that best and worst 1%, right, that you were talking about in the EO context, which is really, really, incredibly powerful if you're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like the depth of experience, people will get to know you a lot better if you do that. I've got a question from Claudia who asks, did you start, I assume she's talking about the sevens group, did you start the sevens group and invite others and state what you were planning on doing? So how much of a frame was there when the group was initially formed?
and I must admit, I was invited into it, and it had grown out of essentially an informal dining club. It was in a particular club or restaurant context with a round table, as it happened. And Dan had been enjoying these dinners. And by the way, there are some really good peer-to-peer examples of this, like the Supper Club, founded by Duncan Cheetle. You will have seen others on the call, I'm sure. So I knew I was being invited into something. It wasn't called Sevens at that point. And I knew it was more personal. Yeah. I already knew a couple of the members of the group, but a couple it was new to me. And I don't think there certainly wasn't any manifesto. There wasn't any great, funny handshakes, silly walks or anything either. But I knew I was being brought into a trusted circle. Is that enough for Claudia? Claudia, is that what you're asking? Is that useful?
Yeah, no, it is. I guess I was just thinking of a lot of the work you do, it's for a cause, and so people often want to get involved because it's related to their professional life, but slightly separate. And I was thinking if you're within a company and slightly differently, how you approach it with people, because people might say, I don't want to come around the table and talk about your career and how I can help you. So I was trying to think of how you invite people in when the cause isn't such a very obvious social purpose cause, which you're doing.
That's right. That's right to distinguish. So with something like Turn on the Subtitles, Clean and Cool would be another example, supporting clean tech founders. I would develop a bit of a kitchen cabinet around that on a personal level. And by the way, you might even then separate that from an advisory board in due course. But really, the kitchen cabinet is the sort of people who can be very close to the journey all the way along. Just to be clear, on the Sevens example, it was a very personal thing. We're inviting you in as Claudia, whatever you happen to be doing. It absolutely doesn't matter. And if you were to choose to change everything tomorrow with your career, that's cool too. In no way would your presence in the group be diminished. Yeah. And so that was very powerful, certainly for me. So that was the idea.
Question from Ali in terms of ideas in cabinets. So she asks, did you start with an idea and then move to select the people who'd be most interested in it? So I guess the frame here is, have you ever started a cabinet where it was just, these are a great bunch of people, I don't know what will come out of it, but you're forming a cabinet hoping something does. And then there's a specific idea, as you've said, with TOTS, with tenor, etc., where there's a more specific objective around it. So yeah, if you could just speak to that, it'd be great.
Yeah, and forgive me, is that Ali Spargo asking that?
It is.
No, that's a great question, Ali. Lovely to see you. Yeah, I mean, to be quite honest, I have started things accidentally, as one or two of you might know. Could I really look back and say what I was doing there was casting a kitchen cabinet? Not really. I mean, I think some of you might know that when I saw that David Young, Lord Young of Graffham, had resigned from the Prime Minister's office, I thought it would be funny to cheer him up and go and meet him. So I asked 6 or 8 mates, basically, if they'd be up for going to cheer Lord Young up. We go to his office in Mayfair, we sit around, he says we've cheered him up. It was a bit like the Werther's original advert, now I come to think of it. And without exaggeration, less than 4 weeks later, we became the accidental co-founders of Startup Britain, standing alongside the Prime Minister, launching this nationwide campaign on BBC Breakfast. So that was an accidental, you could call it a mishap really, but that sprang from a deliberate attempt to bring a good group around a thing, which yes, happened to be around this individual, but it also happened to be around entrepreneurship. Yeah. So you might look at COP. By the way, if you want to put in a bid to take over the planetarium or the IMAX cinema for free, at COP26 in Glasgow in November, the deadline's Friday, 5 p.m, by the way. Okay, so even as I say that, you might be rustling together an imaginary cabinet to plot around that. Like minds would be great there, Drew, wouldn't it? You see the world's leading ideas festival, come on. And before you know it, it bubbles up. So yes, Ali, is that a helpful example?
Yeah, it is. Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, it's kind of, I can imagine many different kitchen cabinets for many different purposes. And then it's about, okay, so, putting yourself in other people's shoes, how do you make it appealing for them? And so that they want to join and want to be part of that elite, it feels kind of slightly elite group of people that you get together to have these wonderful conversations with and movements to make a difference. It sounds a wonderful idea. I'm very excited about thinking about mine.
They're good. Well, I think exploring it, and it's such a personal thing. You might not want to use any phrase around it. You might just say, I'm looking to try and build, to get a certain group of people together from time to time. if you go back to the cabinet analogy with the Prime Minister around the cabinet table, think about those areas of expertise. If you think about what you're trying to get done in the next few years, where's your blind spot? What are the areas that you'd like to bolster? So I think be thinking about that. The other thing is, and a good parallel example might be podcasts, thinking, oh gosh, everyone's doing a podcast. If I started one, would it have to go on forever? And it can seem interminable. So my answer would be no. If you're thinking about a mastermind group, what about doing a mini series? Think in TV terms. Would it be interesting to get the same group of 5 or 6 people together for 3 or 4 occasions? Just a thought which could sort of ease you into it. And, you know, chances are after the 4th hour-long Zoom, maybe certain members think, well, that's the end of that. But I would be surprised if it didn't evolve from there. So there's a sort of an easy way into it, Nassos.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, reducing the ask up front and the formality of it just makes it so much more likely that actually you'll get together or, you know, congregate on Zoom or whatever. And
There's a great question from Gideon here, and I'm conscious of others from Lorraine and others. Please, let's rock on. Let's be swift. Sorry.
Absolutely. So Claire asks, how do you insulate yourself when asking for candid advice to ensure that what you're told doesn't bruise your ego too much? That's a good one.
Well, the shocking thought is it helps if you've got quite an ego to start with, I suppose. But on a serious note, you know, you've got to be, I think having some parameters would be helpful. But I think if you're asking from people, it's such a good question. Is that Claire Cunningham asking that?
It is, yes.
Yeah. So I think giving them a sense of the ballpark, you know, if I'm, you know, and for example, it might be telling somebody, expressing some sort of sense of self-awareness about where you think you're at already. Yeah. So for example, my secret passion, I'm telling you, just friends, is songwriting. You know, my dream is to write a #1 hit single. When I share something I've written, a 3-minute pop song, I tell people, it's me playing it at the piano. I tell people, by the way, I know I can't really sing. And I'm not asking you to critique the piano, but what I am asking you to do is give me some brutal feedback on the song. And that shelters me a little bit. Because if they say, well, I think you're a bit nasally, honestly, Ollie, I thought you sounded better 10 years ago. I think, we know that. I'm not asking for that, am I? So I think have some limits around that. Understand that they're doing it with love. And frankly, to use my silly pop song example, if they believe in you as a songwriter, that's good. Because that shows that sort of bedrock of belief. And the feedback can stem from there. So, you know, I would say, Claire, you know, I've seen you be world class at giving founders a good steer when it comes to how they navigate, how they communicate with the world. That is known. If you gave me full permission, we haven't even seen each other for years, but then we could riff off the back of that. But it helps for you to know that I believe that about you first. So that helps me, and we could unpack that so much more. But is that useful to have a flavour there?
That's really helpful, because I think that's the thing that I would be most sort of mindful of going in to ask anybody for feedback or advice is what impact is that going to have on me? Is it going to make me feel fantastic about my next steps, or is it going to put me off?
Yeah, and I think that's the point about longer term relationships as well, isn't it? Saying, you know, I believe that the world isn't full of people who will want to seek out to crush us. We're building those long-term relationships. We're giving them that permission. And if we've got a sensitivity, say, look, I really want to do this, then you can go from there. Nassos, tell me more.
Quick one from Drew Ellis. I'm building a cabinet around my startup Giggly. How many makes an ideal cabinet size? Thoughts on numbers?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? I mean, because of course it could be a physical thing where you actually meet, but even then we should bear in mind that should the cabinet be 20, only 10 of them might be able to meet. So, you know, I've often had a number that typically hasn't exceeded 20 when I've worked on certain ventures, but has begun with only, you know, typically 6 or 8 in certain situations. But I think I think thinking during Giggly, by the way, if you're allowed to say anything about it, I think is epic. But I think what I'd be thinking, as opposed to your wider constellation of advisors, on your kitchen cabinet for Giggly, could you get them together in some form? Would it be interesting or useful to reveal each other to each other? That can give kudos camaraderie, but don't out people to each other without their permission. You don't need any lessons on this from me, Drew. But particularly thinking about the intergenerational thing, particularly thinking about the blend of, and by the way, I think some of these are peers, some of these are people who are perceived to be less accessible by you, and then you've got the occasional rock stars in the mix. Probably quite literally for you, Drew, in the mix.
Exactly. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Ollie. That's really good.
Give us the one. Are you allowed to give us the one-liner on Giggly, Drew?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a platform to help musicians start earning money again. So a bit like Hopin, if you're familiar with the conferencing platform Hopin, but Hopin for Music, which will eventually become Netflix for music. So hugely exciting.
Love it. Watch this space. Thank you. Ali makes a great point about creating safe psychological space. And I suppose that relates to the sort of wider inclusion agenda, you know, casting your cabinet, making it inclusive, but also making people feel that they're able to give candid advice. I think the other point about the cabinet analogy is the value exchange between the members of the cabinet, that they feel, and somebody makes the point, I think Gideon makes the point, that it works better on projects that make people feel good, because part of the value exchange is doing good for the wider world. I've seen some amazingly powerful kitchen cabinets in play around highly commercial business. I think it's just knowing that there's a value exchange, that everyone can gain something and give something. Some of the breakdowns, and I've seen people have to leave mastermind groups before because they just felt that they were giving too much because they were the senior party and not getting enough. And by the way, the getting enough could simply be feel good. It could be a feeling of feeling valued and rewarded, and fun might be another aspect as well. You know, I know Lord Young said, "You've cheered me up." You know, that was an aspect for him. And as he joined our cabinet, if you know, and he was in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, bizarrely. So I think there's something around that, but I don't think this only works at all, or even better perhaps, for socially driven projects. The other point, Nassos, is I think on cabinets, what I'm particularly interested in is that idea that you've got permission to go beyond the commercial. So even in the absence of social impact and huge problem solving, to say, yeah, we might be here to talk about pay-per-click, but we're also here to wonder, you know, what our next venture is going to be, to be really, you know, I think my financial director might be a fraudster. You know, these conversations, I've heard them all.
For sure. No, and actually quite a few of the threads you've touched on there tie into Lorraine's question. So she says, I've had my fingers burned in the past setting up a personal board of advisors, specifically around confidentiality and competition. So a couple of questions. Any advice on how to avoid that happening again? And second question, do you feel people are more open to collaborative opportunities rather than competing these days?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know on that last point. I've realised I'm sort of disappearing into the sun. Apologies for that. Lorraine, it's a great question. My personal techniques on the being let down are, number one, and this is a bit trite, the first one, but I genuinely have always name dropped influential people that I'm connected to in the hope that they won't do a runner and take advantage of me. And I've done that for like 20 years. So it's a slightly silly point, but seriously, if you say, look, you know, that's why we're working with Bird and Bird or Mish Condoré, whoever it might be. The second technique I use is I'm absolutely clear about the difference between riffing around an idea, wouldn't it be nice if, versus my commitment to progressing an idea, I am going to. Because otherwise I think it's sometimes easy for people to say, oh, sorry, Ben, I just thought you've been playful with ideas in your way. And I thought I was permitted to run off with that, or that piece of an idea. So that's the second thing. The third thing is I think I've got better at presenting small numbers of jigsaw pieces, but not the whole jigsaw piece. But I can see how you would feel let down. And that's why I think it's really important. You know, I've hosted a series of meetings over the last year. A couple of people on the call have joined them for an hour. But there I've said, this is not even Chatham House. This is off record, no photos. And please don't ever reveal, it's not like a scene from The Witches or something, but please don't even reveal who was at the meeting. Because given who some of the people were there, to be seen having that coffee in that company at that point, you're wondering who it was now, it just wasn't appropriate. So I think just making it abundantly clear that this is off record, that this is private, we're giving each other permission to be very open here. Is that useful? Prince Charles, yeah, exactly. The Queen told me to stop name dropping as well, Drew. Lorraine, is that helpful? I'm sorry you've been let down.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I had thought I'd done that. You know, the pieces of paper that we had around the table were commercial in confidence. It was a few years ago now, we were going to take an idea forward, but there were issues with the shareholders. And so we were delaying that. And the person went off and did that themselves through their own business. Yeah. And that just kind of hurt really, because there was, you know, we had, I thought we'd spent a year or more probably, you know, exchanging the kind of understanding of the values of what the group was about. And I was kind of ticking off in my mind all of the different things you've been talking about. I think we did that. I think we did that. But clearly there was some things wrong. And I guess at the end of the day, you know, you ultimately, you know, there's always the odd bad fish, I guess, in the pond, you know. But yeah, no, it's incredibly helpful. Thanks, Ollie.
No, good. Well, thank you for all your support as well, Lorraine. Much appreciated. NASA's conscious of time. Thank you, everyone, for these brilliant questions. Have we got time? Have we got time for one more?
Yeah, I think we've got time for a couple of quick ones. So, riffing off of this theme, Francis asks, how blunt would you be in these situations? So obviously, it feels like in some instances she's a bit of a dream killer by being too blunt, but at the same time would feel irresponsible not being honest. So yeah, walk me through the dance that is sort of, you know, being blunt in these types of situations.
Well, now that you know Francis and I were redcoats together, you wouldn't want us walking you through any dance. I got to warn you. I think there's a squaring up that's happening here, isn't there? And we know what's happening, which is, you know, in this situation, and I've seen Francis do this. But seriously, you're saying, how candid do you want me to be? And then you say, no, very candid. Say, seriously. But, you know, I think you need to establish that. But I think also be aware that you're saying that what I'm going to be sharing with you, or what you're inviting them to share, if you flip it round, is one person's view. Yeah? It's not casting judgment. Now, in terms of the power exchange, you know, I've got very mixed feelings about, you know, as you say, trampling on the dreams of, particularly in my life, lots of startup entrepreneurs. At the same time, I don't think we do each other any favors if we are, and I'm guilty of this a lot, if we're just relentlessly positive about everyone that ever crosses our paths. So I think, Francis, what I would say is I'd establish the rules of that. And then I'd go back to the famous, you know, SHIT sandwich technique as well. So when I gave some invited feedback to my friend last week, it wasn't just, you know, silly platitudes in the first piece of bread. I wanted to say what I thought was great about her hosting, which was a lot. I then tried to give a lot more feedback, which was a bit more brutal. So I think I'd sandwich it in that way. Why do you think you go too far, Francis?
I would say yes. Well, not necessarily. I think it's partly because, given a lot of my professional work is fixing broken businesses, I'm probably a pessimist to start with. And I'm not sure someone who's coming up with a new idea necessarily wants to have all the things that might well go wrong pointed out, particularly at that early stage when it's still a dream.
I think the wonderful thing, and let me be clear, I'm not an expert on this. I'm just trying to share personal experiences that I have been lucky enough to go through. But I think something quite special happens when you join a group. And that's why I keep coming back to this cabinet thought, because you then know that you can be as brutal as you like to me, but you're also, and it's not about having a fight about it, but it's also the peer-to-peer understanding that you're going to invite my feedback at some point in the near future anyway. And for me, that gives a sort of sense of equity and respect that we can all enjoy and learn from each other on. So hopefully that's useful.
Final one, Ollie, just as we move towards the end, from Bridget. What advice would you give to early stage businesses who feel they can only get great advisors if they pay them?
Yeah, nothing wrong with paying advisors. You know, having been through some extraordinarily beneficial relationships like that, particularly in the last year. I think that there's a huge amount of generosity out there, a huge amount of goodwill. And I think that the key is to be quite clear about the stage you're at, to be quite clear about the sort of interactions you'd like to have with somebody. And to be clear, you know, is this a sounding board from time to time? And also, what's in it for them? And by that, I mean, what's driving their involvement? Is it to make them feel good? Is it a sense of giving something back? Is it that they see something of you in their younger years in them, or vice versa? So I'd think about that. And then I'd also think to myself, to what extent am I asking this person to do what it is they normally get paid for? And I'd be mindful of that. So for a graphic designer, Drew designed some of the best known album covers of all time. I think there's a difference, I think, Drew will correct me, between saying, Drew, can I get your counsel on something, your pithy advice, your feedback, a sounding board, and saying, Drew, would you mind having a first crack at this album cover for me? Yeah, there's an important line there. At the same time, if I continually draw Drew into review meetings of my own art and creativity, that line might start to get blurred. I mean, Drew, real example, you probably get asked for your advice all the time.
Yeah, it's true. You know, happy to give an initial piece of advice, but if it's something that's suddenly going to start creating something for somebody, then that's a whole different conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, I just think it's such a personal thing, and I get told off for this because, you know, you will see people get very animated. I understand why about being asked to do free work. Now, I'm incredibly fortunate. I charge money to host and MC events. Am I in the slightest bit offended if someone asked me to host an event for free? No, because I've got so many motives for doing pro bono work. Now, that is my privilege speaking, and a lot of people might rightly take exception to the idea of asking anyone to do anything for free. So I will stop there, but I just noticed there's a huge amount of generosity there. It's just important to be respectful of people's time.
Just the final one, Ollie, while we're on the question of boundaries, very quickly from Ollie Bond. He asks, should you avoid friends in the kitchen cabinet altogether to keep it more professional? Interesting question about the blurred lines there.
No, so I don't think so at all. Again, this is not the gospel on this. You will have your own personal view on this. For me, I've been so lucky that some of my favorite people in business have gone on to become dear friends. You know, in fact, I had a rule and have a rule that I wouldn't co-found a business with someone that I wouldn't want to spend time at in a personal situation. Does that mean that all my colleagues become friends and best friends? Absolutely not. So for me, there's a certain fluidity, you might say, with some of these relationships. But if you're thinking about inviting that person into your kitchen cabinet for a particular project or very personally, should you think about excluding them because they're a friend? I would say not. That could be an amazing reason to get them involved. And you've made me think, actually, you know, I could probably do a better job of welcoming some dear friends into my other activities world, because at the moment they're sort of, you know, taking the mickey out of me on WhatsApp for a dodgy shot on the news. But, you know, I'm all for that, but take it, you know, it's a very personal choice. So please don't take that as advice.